I never thought I would ever say. I think I agree with AOC. Woke one was crazy, but I don't for a minute believe she's changed her positions.
5 stories, no BS.
President Donald Trump faked his own exit from Air Force One. He walked up the stairs of the plane on camera, then secretly slipped out through a catering container, was smuggled onto a military jet, and flew to England in total secrecy, while the plane full of journalists and staff who thought he was still aboard took off first as a decoy for missiles. That's great. This was a real threat to the life of the president, but the reason he was vulnerable in the first place is that he'd been flying around in a lavishly gifted Qatari 747 that didn't have the security infrastructure of an actual Air Force One. So this whole humiliating scramble was substantially self-inflicted.
Look, the job of the Secret Service is protect the president, and I applaud them for their creativity. The whole controversy here, I don't quite see it the same way as the media wants to talk about this. The plane shouldn't have been used as a decoy, and we need to investigate why the military, Secret Service, and U.S. intelligence service even allowed Air Force One to take off, but that's not the real issue. The real issue is the United States president was under a direct threat during a NATO meeting. How could this happen? It means intelligence and security breakdowns far before this moment. We have a serious intelligence issue here that needs to be looked at because we never should have gotten this far.
Not since Arnold Schwarzenegger's protagonist ended up with a towel wrapped around his head in Total Recall has a supposedly macho protagonist looked so weak and ridiculous. Look, I would like to extend a little bit of sympathy to the president of the United States who was under a threat to his life. There have been actual assassination attempts against this US president before, except for the genesis of this was all in him taking this Qatari bribe, this lavish, ornate bribe from Qatar of a 747 Air Force One replacement without the needed security on it to protect him. And that's how he ended up sneaking around inside a catering cart. He brought that on himself.
Karoline Leavitt is leaving the White House. There is some speculation online that she's leaving because she was left on the decoy plane. I don't know if that's true. The internet likes to lie, but it might be part of it.
I think everyone in the Republican Party can sympathize with the idea of leaving to spend more time lying to your family. Karoline Leavitt has had a disastrous, beclowning tenure as White House press secretary. Her opening line at her very first briefing in January of 2025 was a promise to, quote, hold myself to the truth, which she followed immediately by a lie, a false claim about the Biden administration giving out condoms in Gaza, which was bullshit. Her entire job seemed to be to attempt to belligerently launder whatever lie was floating through the transom of Donald Trump's brain at the moment to placate him, please him. She claimed that tariffs are a tax cut for the American people. She claimed that Trump's tax and spending bill, the one big beautiful bill, does not add to the deficit. She made up stuff about the egg shortage. Look, every White House press secretary says things that are a spin. That's their job, right? They're trying to put as good a face as possible on this. She took this to such an extreme. She should not have another job in media. She should not have another job in politics. She has disqualified herself, but she's going to get such a job, probably from Fox, which is probably where she got spawned in the first place.
Look, she has been no different than previous White House secretaries in the fact that their job is to lie for the president. We saw this in the Biden administration when the press secretary said she could barely keep up with Biden. We know that was a bold-faced lie.
All right, that is fair. That is fair.
Right. But here's the biggest difference, and here's where I think you and I agree, is that we have gone from treating the press as an adversary to treating them as the enemy. And to me, that is the fundamental problem with Karoline Leavitt. She's done a great job as far as doing Trump's bidding, but she has just gone to treat them like the enemy. And I think the next press secretary is going to be even worse. And that's a detriment to the American public.
Speaking of waking up, I felt like I did one of these. What? Earlier this week when AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, did a woke walk back. She actually said, quoting someone else's observation, that woke 1.0 was crazy. This could just be political positioning, or it could be some real deep thought.
So I'm going to say something I never thought I would ever say. I think I agree with AOC. Woke one was crazy, but I don't for a minute believe she's changed her positions. I think she's trying to get herself set up to run for president in 2028. And I think she still believes every single thing that she did. This is like Gen Z telling employers not to pay attention to their social media because they were just young and stupid. The difference is she was a congresswoman at the time, and she does believe all this wackadoodle stuff. I think she's just trying to pull it back and make it look less crazy so that maybe she has a hope to run for president. I hope the Democrats don't see through this, because I would love to run against her in 2028.
I can't disprove your contention, and I lobbed it up myself, that she's just political positioning here, right? That said, this does come at a moment where there is a reckoning happening. More thoughtful members of the DSA remind me of that line from Almost Famous. They're a mid-level band struggling with their own limitations in the harsh light of stardom. They have had a surge this summer, which means more self-avowed democratic socialists, or people who are friendly to democratic socialists, in office or in running prominently in big races. And that comes with a certain amount of responsibility and a certain amount of introspection about some of the more outlandish positions that DSA leadership has taken, including in their platform, which calls for the end of prisons. No more prisons in America, no more borders in America, and openly praises communism and treats Cuba as a model. These are far extreme positions that most Democrats absolutely abhor, me included. And so I think that there is a real reckoning going on inside AOC's head. I'm not sure. And I think it's a healthy one if it creates space for the same thing to happen with other progressives.
Donald Trump has made it clear that he will not take Supreme Court decisions as the final word on some of the most cherished priorities, seeking ways around rulings on tariffs, birthright citizenship, and the Fed. Experts say the moves don't signal outright defiance, but they push the court's limits.
Okay, warning, I'm going to probably bust through our usual 3-minute time frame for these rundown topics here, because I do have a bit of a counterintuitive here. Look, of course, it's easy and clear to say that Trump is acting lawlessly when he thumbs his nose at the Supreme Court, but it's also worth challenging the underlying premise. This is a great episode of The West Wing, if you ever watched it. They have a whole episode about the idea of not accepting the premise of a question that comes to you. And in this case, the premise here is that judicial review, where the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of what is constitutional, what is not, what is allowed in our society and what is not, what is legal and what is not. That idea of judicial review, that's the premise that's being presumed here, that everything the Supreme Court says has to be the final word. I don't agree with that, because for one thing, that is not in the Constitution. That is a right that the Supreme Court gave to themselves. It's a power that they inferred in the Constitution, that they delegated to themselves as far back as Marbury versus Madison, and that we have subsequently gone along with. If you believe in originalism, strict constructionism, or any other conservative judicial philosophy that has at its core a belief that what we are allowed to do in our country is written out in the Constitution, the idea that the Supreme Court gets the final say is not in there. And I will tell you something else. In my view, the Supreme Court is the most broken of our three branches of government. The fact that the presidency, the executive branch, has become so broken is because the Supreme Court has allowed it to become so, especially recently under Donald Trump, by giving him immunity and impunity. Just to bring this full circle, it is bad when Donald Trump acts above the law, acts outside the law, says that he gets to declare what the law is. But I'm not sure that the corrective is going back to the premise that the Supreme Court, the unelected judges in a deeply corrupt, and we know that these justices, many of them are corrupt, Clarence Thomas, John Roberts, the idea of going back to the Supreme Court to fix it, that I don't accept. I think that the corrective here is to once again elevate the branch of government that is listed first in the Constitution, in Article 1, the Congress, and to have the branch of government that is closest to the people, where all power should derive in a democracy, have that branch of government be the ultimate arbiter of what is allowed, what is legal, and what is constitutional in America. I think that's a proposition that's at the very least worth discussing and not blithely assuming.
The real institutional failure here is Congress. They have spent decades handing power to presidents because voting on things is hard and politically dangerous. And now Trump is testing those limits to the absolute nth authority. And Mike Johnson has failed as speaker. And the real problem that we have here is we don't have three branches of government working. I agree with you 100% that Congress is this failure.
Last we checked in, Paramount had a $110 billion bid active to buy the parent company, Time Warner, of CNN. The DOJ under Donald Trump has tacitly blessed this after receiving some praise and a little bit of backsheesh from David Ellison. 12 state attorneys general aren't buying into it one bit, and they have brought suit. And now Paramount is offering to sell off CNN entirely to make the lawsuit go away.
It's a bargaining chip because the other piece of this story is there's looking to be a board that's going to be an independent advisory board on some of this. I think CNN is losing ratings day in and day out. They're tanking in the numbers. So I think it's a bargaining chip. I don't know if they will actually sell it, but it definitely shows how bad the media is and how segmented we're becoming, where a news organization that revolutionized 24-hour news, that set the standard for it, is now so far gone that it could be bargained away and sold in just a blatant effort to buy their way into an approval to make more money. News is going very corporate. That's why you're seeing all these other outlets, because 24-hour news like CNN is becoming less and less reliable as it tries to market to different segments and plays to the corporate ownership.
In a very meta way, I had a slip of the tongue a few minutes ago when I said Time Warner. That's from a previous corporate merger. Now the entity is Warner Brothers Discovery, from a different corporate merger that preceded this attempted corporate merger. And look, corporate ownership of media has become especially fraught these days as corporations have knuckled under to pressure from Trump. No one has gone further than Paramount. But what really jumps out to me here is just how much all of this is working from these 12 attorneys general. It really creates a template for much more active enforcement of what's supposed to be federal law and federal enforcement from the state level, because we now know that the Trump administration will not enforce the law. They're not going to actually act in the public's interest. It is back to these attorneys general. And by the way, they have every ability and every right to do this kind of thing for lower levels of the Trump administration, to go after DOJ staffers who break privacy laws when they break into the Social Security Administration. I think that this is a real template for what could be the move of the future.